Captains of Industry, brought to you by Airtel.
Lloyd is regarded as the world's leading specialist insurance company. It's steeped in history and tradition, over 300 years old. It was a company that insured the first airplane, the first car, for instance. The big challenge was to modernize this, which is effectively a British institution. Lord Peter Levene is the chairperson of Lloyd's. He's our captain of industry tonight. Thanks for staying with us. Now, before the break, we were talking about the changing world order economically and where Asia features within the broader framework of Lloyd's. What about Africa?
Well, it's a very good question. Our business for the Lloyd's market in South Africa is a very good business. It's about 2.5 billion rand in terms of premium annually, which puts it up as an important market. The rest of Africa, very little. What we would like to do is to try and use South Africa as a base to expand our business more into the other African markets, but that's a tough call.
Why is that a tough call? I mean, some people are so bullish, for instance, about frontier markets in Africa, the fact that about 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world are on the continent, the fact that you've got the 8th largest producer of crude oil being Nigeria, being on this continent.
Well, you know, I started my life working quite a long time ago, and almost the very first country I ever went to was Nigeria. And if you look at Nigeria, where they have phenomenal natural resources in terms of oil, one would have hoped they would have made better use of them. Maybe today they will. I know Nigeria relatively well. I know a lot of the people who are there. But if you go to Lagos or if you go to Abuja, you don't see the same infrastructure which you see here. And if you don't have that infrastructure, it's difficult to develop the economy. That's what the Chinese got right. Years ago, you go to China and you see them building these phenomenal highways, which seem to go from nowhere to nowhere. But what they were doing was they got the infrastructure right. They knew that you had to put in the infrastructure first, then you could have the development. And that hasn't happened in Nigeria. Here, of course, you do have an advanced infrastructure. That's why this economy is much stronger and much better.
So baby steps in Africa. Recently we've had the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and we're told that as yet we haven't quite quantified the costs. But given your extensive experience as Lloyd's dealing with disaster management insurance, how big a hit was that for the sector?
A lot of the Japanese losses were actually covered by the Japanese insurance industry, or indeed by the Japanese government. Because if you look at those terrible pictures that we saw what happened, you will see that most of it was outside the large cities. Had it been in Tokyo, it might have been different, but it would also have been easier in some ways, because in Tokyo they're so used to major earthquakes, so the buildings there are designed so they actually roll with the punches. Tokyo, or rather Japan, the earthquake and the tsunami will be a big claim, but it's, as far as we're concerned, in the normal course of business. However, you look at the start of this year, what did we have? We had floods in Australia, we had the second earthquake in New Zealand, which from Lloyd's point of view would be getting on towards the same sort of cost as the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. And then we had these huge windstorms, not hurricanes, but windstorms in the United States. So Japan, yes, it's a big claim. Is it something which shocked us beyond belief? No, because it's part of our normal business.
We've been talking about how the world is changing and your perspective in that regards, and certainly you can't control natural disasters. But global security is also an issue that's come to the fore. You mentioned 9/11, and you know, I think also the sort of the very tangible, palpable psychological effects it's had on the world. As we contemplate how the world is changing from a security perspective as well, what has that meant for the way you do business?
Well, we can only encourage those who insure with us to make sure that their security is well founded, because if it isn't, they're going to get hit and we're going to have bigger claims. You know, I noticed coming in this building, you have to show a security pass to get in. 20 years ago, would that have been the case? No way. In London, you can't get in a building now without showing a security pass. In New York, it's the same thing. I think the world has learned. Is it a happy lesson? No, it's not a happy lesson, but you know, we are where we are, and so we've got to be able to deal with it.
You're also known to insure some very unusual requests, celebrities in Hollywood, for instance, come to you wanting to insure their legs, their hair, their smile. What's the most outrageous, I think, request you've ever had?
Well, all of the above. The hair is an American football player who has hair out here somewhere, and it is his sort of trademark, so he insures against it. We did indeed insure Betty Grable's legs a long time ago, and the equivalent of that today is Ugly Betty's smile. But I mean, in all honesty, those are a bit of a gimmick, and they're not really where we base our business.
Yeah. But you indulge them, though?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if they want to insure, we'll have somebody to work out the cost and they'll pay for it. But much more meaningful is that we did insure, as I think you mentioned earlier on, we issued the very first aviation policy before the Wright brothers had even flown. Yeah. So, you know, we're up there with the technology as well.
Okay, great stuff. Let's talk about you, Lord Levene. We know you are a life peer in the United Kingdom, but you're also a family man with 10 grandchildren. How do they keep you busy?
Oh, they keep me very busy. We have 3 children. One's in New York with 4 grandchildren, and 2 are in London with 3 grandchildren each. They also help to keep your feet on the ground. Yeah. One of my grandsons in London, half term from school, so I said, would you like to come up and see around the Mansion House where the Lord Mayor lives? I think he's going to be out. And come to Lloyd's. So he said, yes, he would. So I took him to Mansion House. He thought that was pretty good. And then we were walking from Mansion House to the Lloyd's building, which is just a couple of 100 yards. And he said, well, you're going to complete your term at Lloyd's, this was last year, at the end of next year. What are you going to do next? And I said, well, I don't know, I haven't really decided yet. And he said, well, I wouldn't really worry about it if I were you. He said, you've been the Lord Mayor of London, you've been Chairman of Lloyd's, I'm sure someone will give you a job. Aww. So they do help to keep, and you know, they're quite perceptive as well. Yeah. And they're a lot of fun.
In this illustrious career that you've had, because also I think it's important, let's tell our viewers that you've come from the defense industry actually before you've come into the insurance industry. What was that transition like for you?
Well, it wasn't quite as abrupt as that. As I was in the defence industry, and then I was pulled out of there almost forcibly by the government and told to change sides and sit on the other side of the table and become the permanent secretary running defence procurement in the Ministry of Defence. Then I went to work for the Prime Minister, John Major, for 4 or 5 years. Then I went into investment banking. Then I went to run Canary Wharf, the big property development in London. Then I went into another investment bank. Then I became Lord Mayor. And then I went to insurance, so it's been a progression.
The reason I'm raising this is, in a career that's so vast and varied, you've had different mentors. Who's really stood out for you?
Well, I think 2 of the politicians in particular. Margaret Thatcher, goes without saying, was the most remarkable woman. You know, some people liked her, other people didn't like her, but without any question, she transformed the economy in the UK, which was in the doldrums at the time, and put it into good shape. And then someone who I worked for under her, Michael Heseltine. Now those 2 didn't actually get on and they fell out, but I learnt an enormous amount from both of them and a lot of wisdom. One small piece of wisdom I will tell you, when I was in the Ministry of Defence, some of my former colleagues in the industry, they weren't terribly happy with me because they thought I knew too much about what was going on the other side of the table. And there was a certain amount of a dirty tricks department going on to try and put me in a difficult position. And one morning there was an article in the paper and I was furious, and I stormed in to see Michael Heseltine, who was the Defence Secretary. I said, look at this, up with this I will not put. And he said, what's the matter? I said, look what it says. He had a look at it. And he said, yes, I see. So he said, I'm now going to teach you a very important lesson. He screwed up the newspaper, threw it in the bin, and he said, just remember this, today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper. And that was a very good piece of advice which I passed on to a lot of other people.
Yeah, okay, so you've got to be perceptive, and you've got to also kind of manage your emotions, is what I'm reading.
You have to count to 10. When I first started working, something would happen, I'd get furious, I'd pick up the phone and start shouting at everybody. And then the next day I thought, that wasn't really a very good idea. So I've learned to sort of sit on these things probably for 24 hours. If you still feel the same the next day, then go ahead, but more often than not you don't.
You're raising something which is not very profound, but which people are talking about more and more, is in order to run a business, an institution, even a country, you need a certain degree of emotional intelligence. And I think the emphasis in recent years is just that, is learning to have good people skills.
Oh yes, absolutely. And people skills are the best. And you know, little things make a big difference.
Okay.
Just saying thank you to people, or giving them a smile every so often, and saying to them they've done a good job, does make a big difference. Now my PA, I don't do that to, and she said, I said, look, you work for me long enough, you know I don't have to tell you that. And she's a toughie, and so if I start ranting and raving, she'll look at me and say, have you finished? And that's important.
Do you really think you've got a temper? So
Me?
Like the second time you've just kind of alluded to the fact that you would throw your toys, your PA would look at you and say, are you finished? You don't strike me as somebody who's that way inclined.
Well, some people will do. I mean, somebody, actually a good friend and colleague of mine, was talking to me quite recently, and he said, you know, you're very, very scary. I said, scary? I don't think I'm scary. He said, you don't understand, you are very scary. Yeah. I think most people have a temper. I think I've learned to control it more, but you know, sometimes you just blow it. You know, you're waiting to check in with a plane and it's late, and then they tell you it's cancelled, and you go, "Argh." And who do you take your wrath out on? Well, it happens to be a poor lady who's standing in front of you telling you that, but you know, that's human nature.
Okay, you also love to ski? Why
Yes.
is that?
Why?
Yes.
Oh, it's good to relax. I mean, skiing is great, because when you're skiing, if you're not concentrating on what you're doing skiing, you're going to get in big trouble.
Yeah.
And so, unlike maybe other things where you've got time to sit there, if you're swimming, you can swim, but you're thinking about all the problems you've got. As you're skiing, you've got to concentrate on that, and so it takes your mind off things. And it's good exercise, and places are all beautiful, and why not?
Okay, we know that soon you'll be leaving Lloyd's. Finally, any piece of advice, wisdom that you'd like to share with your successor?
Yeah, I think my successor, you see, I was the first chairman of Lloyd's who came from the outside world. And so he will be the second one who's come from the outside world. And what I said to him, and I know he's a very smart guy, and he knows this anyhow, but what I said is, look, you'll get all these experts in there who will explain to you in infinite detail, probably most of which you won't comprehend why they're doing something. But if it seems wrong to you, just say, look, I'm sorry, I don't understand. And they say, oh, you wouldn't understand. And then you say, look, don't tell me I wouldn't understand. Unless you can explain it, and I can see that it's the right thing to do, then I'll keep querying it until you get it right. And so don't be too baffled by the experts. You know, very often your first thoughts are your best thoughts.